Hey kids, welcome back to the farm. Good to see you guys again. It has been a long morning on the farm. I am tired. Let me tell you, sheep, they can be so cute and fluffy and cuddly and you just love them and squeeze them. But they can also be kind of difficult, you know? One cool thing about sheep, this is really cool. After a while, after being a shepherd for a while, your sheep learn to recognize your voice. So most of the sheep I can just call and say, hey, come here, and they follow me. And it makes my job really easy when they know me. But there are some stubborn ones. In my flock, there's a couple stubborn ones, and they just love to wander off. They know my voice, and they sometimes choose not to follow it, and they choose to wander off, and I have to go get them. That makes me a little tired. You know, in the Bible, they call Jesus the Good Shepherd, and after being a shepherd, I can understand that. He is a good shepherd because he's so patient when we wander off and when we make sad choices. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself because we're not to Jesus yet. We got a long way to go before we get to Jesus. We're still back at the beginning of the Bible, but we're going to get there. We're in the beginning, and we're learning how God is growing a nation and how he's going to bless the whole world through this nation. But it starts off small, so we're learning how it's growing. So, I'm going to tell you the next story. But our big question that we've been asking is, does God keep his promises? And last week we talked about he always keeps his promises because he's faithful. God is faithful to us. So I'm going to tell you a story today. And we're going to pick up where we left off last week with Jacob running away from his family because he's afraid his brother's going to kill him. And he's running away. And he had the dream or the vision of the ladder going from the earth to heaven and angels going up and down and God renewing the covenant with him. That promise that he made to Abraham. Okay? So, let's talk about that. But I'm going to have a seat again. I'm tired. I've been chasing sheep all morning. Those stubborn little things. So I'm going to have a seat and I'm going to tell you the story. Okay? Here we go. Now, before I tell you this story, I want to talk about one thing. Sometimes in the Bible, some stories have some tricky parts in them. Some things that we have a hard time understanding. And this one has some things in it that are a little weird, a little different, and some things that we know go against God's plan for what life is supposed to look like. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But sometimes we come across stories like this, and it's confusing, and it brings up questions, and it's good to ask those questions. So if you find yourself coming up with some of those today, go talk to your parents about them. They're good questions. Okay, so here's our story. So Jacob ran away from home. He was sent away because Esau wanted to kill him because he stole his blessing. And so he's going to go to his mom, Rebekah's brother, back to her family. And so he heads out and he gets close to where they are and he stops at a well. And there's a bunch of shepherds there who are bringing their flocks, their sheep, to the well. Now, where they live, there's not like streams and ponds and all that stuff like we have here. We've got water everywhere. It comes from the sky most of the time. There, it's a drier place, so they would have to go to the wells to get water. So they're all there at the well getting water, and he asks them, he's like, hey, do you guys know Laban? Who's his uncle, his mom's brother. And they're like, yeah, we know him. In fact, here comes his daughter right now. And here she comes. She's a shepherd also. And she's bringing her sheep in for water. And Jacob looks at her and says, oh, she's pretty. I like her. And he goes and he introduces himself. He's like, hey, I'm Jacob. I'm Rebekah's son. I'm here to see your father. And she's like, great. So he helps her water the sheep. And they head to her father's house, to his uncle's house. And his uncle welcomes him. He's like, yay, your family, welcome. And Laban takes him in and he starts working for Laban as a shepherd. And he's in love with Rachel. And so him and Laban make a deal. He'll work for Laban for 7 years. 7 years, and then he gets to marry Rachel. So great, he works for 7 years, and he says, oh, it just feels like a day because I love her so much and I can't wait to marry her. Well, 7 years comes, and Laban brings together a big party for the wedding, and instead of marrying him to Rachel, he marries him to Leah. He has 2 daughters, Rachel and Leah. Leah was the older one, and he marries Jacob to Leah. He tricks Jacob into marrying Leah. And Jacob's like, what? I did all this work to marry Rachel. And Laban says, well, Leah's older, and our tradition is the older one has to be married first, so you had to marry Leah. But if you work 7 more years, I'll let you marry Rachel. So Jacob, because he loves Rachel, he works for 7 more years, and he marries Rachel also. Now this is the part that gets a little weird, because we know that God's plan is 1 man and 1 woman, and they get married. But here's 1 man, and he married 2 women. And so he wasn't following God's plan and what God intends for things to look like. And that's kind of confusing. So we're going to leave that. If you want to have a discussion with your parents, great thing to ask about. But there are times in the Bible that they do things that we know aren't part of God's plan, and this is one of them. So he marries both of them, but he loves Rachel more. And can you imagine how Leah must feel? Her husband doesn't love her as much. We don't even know if he liked her. He loved Rachel, but it says that she was sad. So God gave her children. She got to have children, and she had several children, and Rachel didn't have any. But that made Rachel sad, and so she cried out to God, and she said, I want kids too. And then God gave her kids, and God gave Leah more kids, and they had lots of kids. In fact, they had 12 sons. 12 sons, that's a lot of sons. And their names were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Wow, those are their 12 sons. And we're learning about how God is growing this family. Wow, it really grew. 12 is a lot. So after a while, they've got all the kids, and God says, go back to Canaan. Go back to the promised land. Go back to your family. And Jacob does. Jacob does. He picks up and he goes. And we're going to talk next week about what happens, because remember, his brother's mad. His brother wanted to kill him. Well, it's been 20 years. And we'll find out how his brother reacts. And you'll have to tune in next week for that. But before we do that, let's review our big question and talk about how this connects to Christ. Okay, so our big question is, does God keep his promises? Yes, he does, because he's faithful. Even if we break our promises, even if we mess up, he is faithful. He is perfect. He always keeps his promises. And he promised that Jacob and his family would bless the whole world. And so he's growing them and they're getting bigger. Okay? But our story today was about Laban tricked Jacob into marrying Leah and Rachel. Now, I always find this kind of ironic. Jacob convinced Esau to give him his blessing, or not his blessing, his birthright, by selling him a bowl of stew. He tricked his dad, Isaac, into giving him his brother's blessing. And then he was tricked by his uncle. Kind of wonder if he deserved it. Anyway, so our last thing, how does this connect to Jesus? Well, remember that whole list of sons I gave you? One of them becomes Jesus's great grandfather. And that was Judah. And this is one thing I find really interesting. Jacob loved Rachel more. But Judah was Leah's son. God chose to use Leah to continue the covenant and to bless the world. He chose to use her son. Even though she wasn't Jacob's favorite, even though she was, her father used her to trick Jacob, he still blessed her by making her Jesus' great-great-great-great-great-great grandmother. She didn't know it then. She didn't know that that's what God was doing, but he still blessed her with that. And I think that's pretty cool. Okay, well, I gotta go see if any more of my sheep have decided to wander off, and I will see you next week, and we will find out what happens when Jacob goes back to his family and sees his brother again. You guys take care. Bye.